Well, let's go ahead and get started then. I am so excited to be here with you all today. Thank you so much for taking time to share your work with us. My name is Wesley Hogan. I'm professor at the John Hope Franklin Humanities Institute at Duke, and really happy to be moderating today's roundtable on public histories in the Latinx South. Please join me in welcoming the panelists, and I want to also welcome everyone who is here with us this afternoon. I'm going to do short introductions and then ask each of the panelists to share for 3 to 5 minutes a little bit about the work in public history that they're doing right now. And then we'll open it up for a roundtable. Mireya Loza. Dr. Loza is an associate professor in the Department of History in the American Studies program at Georgetown, and her areas of research include Latinx history, social movements, labor history, and food studies. Her book, Defiant Brazos, How Migrant Workers Fought for Racial, Sexual, and Political Freedom from UNC Press in 2016, examines the Bracero program and how guest workers negotiated the intricacies of indigeneity, intimacy, and transnational organizing. This wonderful book won the 2017 Theodore Saludos Book Prize, awarded by the Immigration and Ethnic History Society. And also she received the Smithsonian Secretary's Research Prize. She is currently carrying out research for her second book project, tentatively titled The Strangeness and Bitterness of Plenty, Making Food and Seeing Race in the Agricultural West, 1942 to 1965. And prior to joining the faculty at Georgetown, Professor Loza was a curator at the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of American History and an assistant professor in food studies at NYU. Welcome, Mireya. Christopher Carmona is associate professor of Mexican American Studies and creative writing at the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley. He is a member of the ad hoc committee for the Texas State Board of Education for Mexican American Studies and currently serves as the chair of the NACCS Tejas Foco Committee on Implementing Mexican American Studies in Pre-K-12 Education in Texas. Thank you so much, Chris. His short story collection, The Road to Yoron Park, is listed by NBC News as one of the 8 great Latino books published in 2016 and won the NACCS Tejas Award for Best Fiction Book of 2016. He serves on a number of wonderful committees, but the ones that really stood out to me for this particular panel is the Responsible Ethnic Studies Textbook Committee that was awarded the Float Like a Butterfly, Sting Like a Bee Award for Excellence in Educational Leadership from the Mexican American School Board Association. And he has published 3 books of poetry, co-edited 2 anthologies, and co-authored a scholarly conversation book called Nuevas Voces Poéticas, a conversation about the new Chicano-Chicana identities. Currently, he is working on a series of young adult novellas, reimagining the Lone Ranger story as a Chicanx superhero fighting Texas Rangers in the Rio Grande Valley from 1905 to 1920, entitled El Lince, the Ghost Ranger of the Rio Grande. Julio Capó Jr. is a transnational welcome, Chris. Forgive my manners. Julio Capó Jr. is a transnational historian at Florida International University. His research and teaching interests include modern U.S. history, especially the U.S.'s relationship to the Caribbean and Latin America. He addresses how gender and sexuality have historically intersected with constructions of ethnicity, race, class, nation, age, and ability. His first book, Welcome to Fairyland, Queer Miami Before 1940, which came out from UNC Press in 2017, highlights how transnational forces, including immigration, trade, and tourism to and from the Caribbean, shape Miami's queer past. This book has received 6 awards and honors, including the Charles Sidner Award from the Southern Historical Association for Best Book Written on the Southern History. Capó's research extends his commitment to public history and civic engagement. He curated Queer Miami, a history of the LGBTQ communities for History Miami Museum, which was open for 8 months in 2019 and participated in a National Park Service initiative to promote and identify historic LGBTQ sites and contribute a piece on Miami's queer past for its theme study. Prior to entering graduate school, he worked as a broadcast news writer and producer, and his work has appeared in several outlets such as the Washington Post, Time Magazine, the Miami Herald, and El Nuevo Dia. Welcome, Julio. Axel Herrera Ramos and Erik Valera are the inspiring and innovative people behind the podcast Nuestro South, and they round out our group today. Herrera Ramos is the podcast lead host, and Valera is its creative producer and marketing director. I just want to put a quick note on the program, the actual printout. It said Nuevo South. That's incorrect. Nuestro South is the name of the podcast. It is a must listen. Between 2019 and 2021, the Nuestro South podcast has worked to, quote, unpack the experience of being Latina, Latino, Latinx in Nuestro South. We control our narrative. This is for us, y'all, unquote. Valera is Chief Operating Officer at El Centro Hispano in Durham, North Carolina, a nonprofit dedicated to strengthening the community, building bridges, and advocating for equity and inclusion for Latinos in the Triangle area of North Carolina. He uses his expertise in community engagement, grant making, communication, and marketing to facilitate equitable access to educational, economic, and healthful opportunities. Herrera Ramos is a civic engagement director at Poder NC, a 501c4 organization that does civic and leadership development with Latinx, educating the public about Latinx issues and independently supporting candidates who share their values, which are pro-Black, pro-Latinx, pro-LGBTQ, and pro-choice. Herrera Ramos recently graduated from Duke, where he received both the William J. Griffith University Service Award and the Betsy Alden Outstanding Service Learning Award. And I'll just say, as a faculty here at Duke, that's extraordinary. It's very rare for that to happen, for his work to support DACA students and make sure they were at decision-making tables across Duke. Axel is podcast host alongside Brian Mejia and Daisy Almonte and Dorian Gomez, and Valera is producer along with Julie Weiss and Elaine Townsend-Uten, and the podcast is edited by Dorian Gomez. As one listener reflected, quote, this podcast is a must listen if you're looking to hear real Southern, brilliant Latinx people, perspectives, and history from the American South. Daisy, Axel, and Brian expertly help fill the huge gap many of us have in our whitewashed historical knowledge of America, end quote. So welcome, Erik and Axel. So good to have everybody here with us today. And I'm going to ask in a minute each panelist to introduce themselves and talk briefly about their recent work in Latinx public history, and then we'll switch to a roundtable format, posing questions to one another. I will just add at this point, after 20 or so months on Zoom, it can certainly feel a little bit alienating in the conference space where we can't physically be together to share that presence and deeper awareness of how one another are doing. Spend time with meaningful side conversations and building collegial bonds. So since all of the panelists have taken time out today and the folks in the room, I'll just ask those of you who are here with us today to do your best to join in and tell us what you're thinking and experiencing in the chat. Encourage us to further explore ideas that you hear from the panelists that intrigue you. And please, of course, share questions that arise for you that you'd like to hear more about from these creative, esteemed colleagues. So, Professor Loza, would you mind starting with a brief overview of your work, and then we'll move to Professors Carmona, Capó, and then I'll ask Mr. Herrera Ramos and Mr. Valera to round us out.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Mireya Loza. I actually have a PhD in American Studies and a master's in Public Humanities. And that's usually something people ask me about because they're like, what's Public Humanities? And I always think of public history basically turned up a notch, which means like we think about all of the ways we learned history, whether it's television, historical sites, movies, any and every way you think and encounter the past. I first started working on the Bracero History Project when I was a graduate student at Brown University, and I basically stayed with the project throughout its duration. The Bracero History Project was a project headed up by the National Museum of American History to document the stories of braceros and their entire families in the communities they impacted. We traveled around the US, Mexico. I trained groups and students all over to collect these stories, and we basically built one of the largest thematic repositories of migrant oral histories, which is you can find on braceroarchive.org. We also made sure to hit the South, and so we made sure that the stories in the South were also preserved. And oddly, the South presented a really interesting challenge because we, were told multiple times, well, not many braceros stayed in the South. And so how do you capture a history of people who ultimately migrated and returned to Mexico? And what we found is that we could, by talking to basically white farmers, Black farmers, growers, talking to communities that remembered having braceros there and thinking about their impact. And lo and behold, we did find some pockets of braceros. The archive basically was a cornerstone of a traveling exhibition that traveled for over a decade, introducing the entire nation, I would say, to Bracero history. From there, I actually had a short stint as an assistant professor at the University of Illinois and headed back to the museum because I really loved working, and still do, on public history. And so I still hold a partial line at the National Museum of American History, and I'm working on a couple of big projects, one on collecting Spanish language television history, which is a little out of my wheelhouse in that I mostly think and write about agricultural workers. But what unifies this project is really thinking about the labor of those who built Spanish language television. And for this specific project, Miami has risen as a central site of exploration, and thinking about migration to places like Florida. And then I'm also working at the National Museum of American History on a super cool small project that is actually a little bit newer, headed up by Dr. Sam Vong, called The Nation of Sanctuary. And for this project, I actually am helping develop basically a collection site in Dunn, North Carolina. And why Dunn, North Carolina? Dunn, North Carolina is an exceptional place in which the Episcopal Farm Workers Ministry works with people throughout the food system. And they work with agricultural communities. And for them, agricultural communities takes on a real USDA approach in that they're interested in livestock, in poultry, in actual farm workers. And basically, it's been a really great opportunity to think about immigration and the food system. Thus far, we've collected, a good handful of oral histories and objects and material culture of both folks who've been long time standing members of Dunn, North Carolina's community, and also folks who are newly arrived. And we're thinking about what the material culture is for this specific site. And for me, I basically work public history on several kind of collecting in several layers. One is collecting oral histories, but then secondly, it's building collections for the nation, which means when you go to the National Museum of American History, you look at things in boxes and glass, and I need to find the things that we put in those boxes and glass and the things we preserve for a very long time. Because the magic of a museum experience is really the text, the images, the objects, and the design. And so we're always sort of looking for those wow objects. And in Dunn, North Carolina, we surely have found some of those. And it's quite a challenge when you think about the material culture of a community that has migrated, because I will tell you that for communities that migrate, the material culture looks different than for communities that have been in one place for hundreds of years. They often don't have housing stability, and they often choose to preserve things that are near and dear for a variety of reasons that are not necessarily known to most people. So they might not have sort of like the, gems passed down from the great, 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 great grandfather or grandmother, but they might have something that their mom gave them the day they left their town. Could be a scapulary, could be a rosary, could be all sorts of things. So the challenge in Dunn, North Carolina is to really think about material culture and collecting in much more dynamic ways than traditionally thought of. So that's kind of what I do. And I tried to do some of the highlights of what I do in the South. And we can talk about it.
Thank you so much, Professor Loza. Chris?
Sure. So my name is Christopher Carmona, and I have multiple hats here. But I'm one of them is for the working toward bringing ethnic studies, Mexican American studies, to the public schools here in Texas, and which has been an endeavor that we have done for I can't even think, since 2013. So we're coming up closely here, around 8 years since this has happened. And we were able to get, it took 5 years fighting the State Board of Education here to get a Mexican American Studies course accepted for a high school course, a state approved course, which was a huge victory in 2019. And then last year we got the African American History course approved here in Texas as well. And of course, now we're paying for it because the state of Texas is passing all these ethnic studies, what they call critical race study bills here. So, but we're still pushing these classes, and they're still making pretty well. We have over 50 districts in Texas that are teaching some sort of Mexican American studies course. So it's pretty hard to shut it down at that point. But that's Texas for you. Well, the work that I do besides doing that kind of work is, I'm going to put it here, is the work that I do with Refusing to Forget, which is so Refusing to Forget is we're a national nonprofit organization to bring the public history of violence against Latinos, Mexican Americans to the public in a lot of different ways. It's myself, Monica Munoz Martinez, who just won the MacArthur Genius Award, Dr. Sonia Hernandez, Dr. John Moran Gonzalez, Dr. Benjamin Johnson, and Dr. Trinidad Gonzalez. And we've been working on bringing the history of what happened here in the early 20th century down in South Texas to the world. But as we started this project, which is what kind of my books are about in a lot of ways, it's become a national. And I mean, we've had so many inquiries from all over about with the history that we're bringing, and it's because of this work that that Monica was able to win that Genius Award, and that's where all of the money from that is going to help spread the word across what's going on. So for those of you who are not familiar with the era we're talking about, in the early 20th century in what is deep South Texas, which is south of the Nueces River, to what is the Rio Grande, that was for a long time considered disputed territory. It wasn't considered Texas, and it wasn't considered Mexico for a long time. So this area was controlled primarily by about 5 different Mexican American families. Most of them were women who ran these massive ranches, and they controlled this area for about 300 years, right? And so we get to the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, and this area starts to be prospected by major American corporations and things of that nature, and it creates this kind of environment where these companies and a lot of the state of Texas and others want to these lands because they want to turn this area into agricultural. But the families are not willing to sell their properties, right? Because they've had these lands for hundreds of years. They're very rich in ranching cultures. So they go to the state of Texas and that's when they get basically enlisted with the help of the Texas Rangers to basically terrorize these families and these people out of their lands. It's done in multiple ways, but during this time, which is known as La Matanza, is the time when hundreds to thousands of Mexican Americans were murdered by Texas Rangers and other law enforcement, as well as vigilante groups during about a 10-year period, which did lead to a lot of these families losing their wealth, losing their lands, a lot of people losing their lives. And my personal connection to this story is my great-grandfather. It was my grandfather's the one who told me these stories when I was a kid, because this is not in the history books at all for a long time. He had to take his family into Mexico in the middle of the Mexican Revolution because it was safer over there than it was on this side of the border. And so they had to leave our lands, everything here, to go live there for 2 years. And then they came back. But this is a time frame that affected so many people, and it was a huge event that is not in the history books as of to date. And when I first started this project, I didn't realize that. I started this project like 10 years ago. I just thought everybody knew these stories until I started to look, and there wasn't anything. So that's what started all of us kind of on, even though like myself and Trini and others are, you have these stories that are connected to this, but it really wasn't until we got together at a conference to start to realize that these stories need to come out. And this is a huge tragedy. And in 2019, we got the state of Texas, or the legislature, to acknowledge that there was state-sponsored violence done down here in South Texas, which was a huge thing. And now there's like backlash, obviously, because of the work that we've done. But it has gotten a national attention. So this is the work that I've been doing, and you know, I've been doing this work for a long time. A lot of oral history work, a lot of working. We got into actually 4 historical markers put up in Texas that recognize this violence, which is part of the public history work that we do. One in outside of El Paso called Porvenir, Texas. There's a documentary on PBS made about this. We have one in Laredo, which recognizes Jovita Hidad, who was a very prominent reporter, and she's the only one who is really reporting on the violence here. And 2 in my area, one in what's Hidalgo County, which represents the murders of two actually county commissioners who were Mexican American, and their murders were not even investigated. And then the one we got out toward the Brownsville area, that recognizes the entire era. And that only happened within the past 6 years, right? These historical markers went up. And so we've done a lot of this work. We're working with, you know, different people, different mediums. We've been contracted by Amazon Studios to be historical consultants because they're trying to do a TV version of the movie Giant, which was actually a book based on South Texas, but in the movie that was made in the 1960s with James Dean and them, they put it in West Texas, which is weird because it's about the King Ranch and the horrors that they did. And then somehow it got transported to West Texas because, you know, that's what Texas looks like. And so this show is supposed to be they contacted us because they want to actually cover the Mexican American side of what happened during that whole time. And so these are the things that we're getting. And so this is all kind of public history that we've been working with. And in the past year or so, we've been ramping up, doing a lot of this work. And my own personal work is connected to this, right? That's where my stories and, you know, bringing this through fiction and also through articles in that Reverberations of Racial Violence anthology we just brought out, things of that nature. But yeah, I'm going to go ahead and stop there for now. But thank you.
Thank you so much. Professor Capó.
Hi, can you hear me okay? I keep coming in and out a little bit, so like it's been a little shaky. So if it gets like that, just please tell me, and I don't know what I would do. I'd throw myself somewhere. Anyway, it's such I don't know. It's such an honor to be here with you all, and I mean that really sincerely. Whose work I greatly admire, whose works I assign, and to have this critical conversation at such a necessary time. So just thank you for putting this together, for having us all together in the space. I left UMass Amherst after 8 years and came to FIU in Miami, Florida, about 2.5 years ago now, which is the largest HSI here in my hometown in Miami, to help build a public humanities program here, the Wilsonian Public Humanities Lab, the WPHL, where we have a number of ongoing public-facing projects. But I mean, so in the kind of roundtable, I'll talk a little bit about some of those things perhaps. But for here, I just wanted to kind of speak mostly about what Wesley noted, and that's the curation of my exhibition for History Miami Museum called Queer Miami, A History of LGBTQ Communities, that closed in late 2019. And there's still kind of iterations of that project that are ongoing. It was the main exhibition at History Miami Museum, which is Florida's largest history museum, located in downtown Miami, in the heart of downtown Miami. There's a few things I just want to note about that. It's a mainstream history museum. It's not an LGBTQ museum or a museum that's dedicated to studying or ever been invested in studying sex, gender, or sexuality, certainly. And this was the first exhibition of its kind that dealt with this content directly. I've done considerable public history work with the local LGBTQ museum, the Stonewall National Museum and Archive in Fort Lauderdale. But this exhibition really brought these topics and themes and even communities to the museum, ones that had no doubt been erased, silenced, and marginalized in the past. So even just to see signs for something called Queer Miami on billboards, on newspaper ads, and the metro buses throughout what could often be a very conservative city in many ways, in these public spaces, was really powerful for me and for so many others in this way that, you know, you felt seen and kind of heard. So just a few things that I want to say. This is that was in 2019 that it came out, but right off the bat, I just want to make clear that prior to that experience, that's no longer true, but prior to that experience, I had never curated anything before, and at least not in a traditional sense. So I really did my homework. So prior to graduate school, I worked as a journalist in broadcast. So I had a lot of public facing experience doing, you know, and knowledge, but curating is a really different monster. So I read a lot into the curatorial process and consulted with lots of friends and colleagues, and visited as many exhibitions as I possibly could with a different eye, that is the curator to be. And this was a really productive and challenging experience for me, in part because I was a member of this community. That is, like, I had hoped that I had earned its trust, which is something that I think is really critical to this process, for the over 15 years that I've been doing this kind of work as a scholar, as an activist, and as a member of that community, to continue to earn that trust and to maintain that trust. So it was an ambitious project that covered over 100 years of history in a 5,000 square foot space. Mostly I began with the 1890s when Miami was founded and formally incorporated as a city in 1896, even though it went a little further back to give some kind of necessary context for national and even Florida history. And just to kind of briefly give an overview, and then I'll be quiet. But broadly speaking, the exhibition represents the greater diversity, that is, thinking about the intersectional experiences of Greater Miami's LGBTQ communities across racial, ethnic, class, and national lines. So a lot of this focused in particular on the Black and Latinx experience. It offered snapshots of this history, exploring how queer people have been policed and criminalized, how they develop cultures of resistance, how their stories link to experiences way beyond our national borders, and how the movement can move forward mindful of that past. So very much, based on the research and arguments that came out of my book, Welcome to Fairyland, Queer Miami Before 1940, but also my dissertation, which covered the post-1945 history. So this exhibition was committed to placing the creation of a gay leisure culture in the context of colonialism and anti-Black violence that built this space. That is, to understand the creation of Miami as a white fairyland, we must understand how that was built on the backs of Black, brown, and indigenous labor, and that it was too often dependent on the exploitation, the violence, and inequity of those folks. That is, I imagine that the telling of this history was also a reckoning and an opportunity to acknowledge that the past and seek to change course, as so much of this is not history at all, but very much a part of our present. And I'll just end there, but there's lots of obviously things that we can talk about. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Mr. Ramos and Valera, do you want to present together or do you want to do sequential? Whichever your preference is.
Would you like to go first, Erik? Give us an intro.
I think you're muted.
Thank you. Sorry. I'll give my perspective, and then I'll let Axel give his perspective, and he can help demonstrate the product that we have. So Erik, my name is Erik Valera, and a little bit about where my story kind of originates here is some of my background. My mother is from Mexico, from Durango, Mexico, and my father is from Guantanamo, Cuba. I was born in Chicago, raised in Miami until I was 16. Then I moved to Los Angeles, and I've been living in North Carolina for the last 14 years. In 2015, I was working with the Latino Commission on AIDS, and I was working as the director of a project called Latinos in the Deep South. We set out to do a needs assessment, a community needs assessment around community engagement about how we can help improve the health of this emerging community, this emerging Latino community. So this isn't, in this case, we weren't including Florida or Texas because there was already established enclaves there. This was about an emerging community. And so as we went out, as we set out, we developed a report called Latinos in the Deep South Being Visible by Piercing the Stigma Veil. And part of what we identified here was that there was a stigma associated with Latino identity in the South. And then this report was really focused on how we could engage the community. But as we look further into it, what we realize is that this stigma very much stems from the fact that people are considered an other, right? There's this binary culture, which is primarily Black and white, and then there's everyone else. And so when we look at the data, we see that since 1990, there's been a full generation of people who have come of age in this geography, and that within this, they have gone to school and have not seen themselves represented in history books or in contemporary media in any ways. And so this has pretty much rendered folks to feel, very isolated, silent, and invisible. So I was, as many inspirations often happen, listening to National Public Radio, and I heard this story. I was listening to an interview of Julie Weiss, and she was talking about her book Corazón de Dixies, Mexicanos in the U.S. since 1910. And I said, what? We were here since 1910? So I emailed her, and she goes, read the book. And then I read the book, and then I emailed her again. And I said, these stories need to get out there. We need to be able to, these stories need to be represented, and particularly to this generation that has come of age since, what we're calling is the Great Latinx Migration that occurred from the 1990s to the 2000s. There's a whole generation that needs to know that they are represented in history, and more than that, deserve a sense of belonging and entitlement to this geography. So we first set out to, we iterated a lot. We spoke for a long time trying to figure out how we might be able to make this accessible. We watched a lot of YouTube videos. We watched a lot of really trying to understand what is the, where can we meet this population where they're at. And so we applied for a few grants. We got a little bit of money and go, what can we do with that money? So it's like, well, podcast seems to be the lowest bar of entry. So let's do a podcast. But it couldn't just be a podcast with Julie and I. We're of a different generation. We're not the target audience that we were getting to. So we used that money to be able to identify some folks who would be able to do this. And so we partnered with Latinx Ed, who is at the time, they were out of the School of Education at the University of North Carolina, who connected us with a group of really talented people, including Axel, that would help us interpret these stories in a way that was meaningful to this population. And so we created this. So we started with a podcast. We really didn't actually know what we were doing. We had them read it and then just do it like as if it was a class. And over time, what we did was we developed this model. And this model to be able to, our team has grown. We have a social media director now. We have many more people, and we're in this, most of our team is within this population. And so we're learning from them, what are the changes that are going on in media? What are the changes that are going on? And how do you tell authentic, evidence-based stories that are going to reach this audience? And so, that's where we had been now. And so, like, the next step then is to be able to scale that to include more researchers and find a broader audience. And to that, I'm going to pass the mic to Axel so he can tell where he came in and his perspective of this story.
Gracias, Erik. Let's see. I think the best approach is to kind of introduce how I come into this, give a little bit of context of the more recent work we've done, and maybe end with just a bit of a teaser that we had for some content that we have yet to put out. But my name is Axel Herrera. I am an immigrant from Honduras. I came when I was 7 years old. We first got to New York City. It was my mom, my cousin, my younger sister, and I. I was 7, and we lasted in New York City about 6 months. Then we came to visit family who was in Charlotte that had recently moved away from New York, and we never went back to New York. So the visit turned into, let's stay at family's apartments, and then it was into moving at another apartment nearby. So I've grown up in North Carolina ever since then. So it's a bit over 16 years now. I moved mostly from the Charlotte area to a more small town area in Alamance County, and the last few years home has been Durham, North Carolina, where I attended high school, and then the time I was here during college at Duke was also Durham. And so I came into this kind of work with Nuestro South partly through that connection of Latinx Ed and the pitch of like, hey, we're doing something interesting related to the history of Latinos in the South. And they were like, why don't you send a video to us, kind of like pitching like what you interpret from these, they were like broad questions about Latinos in the South. And I went out for 10 minutes straight, just like on my computer camera. This is what I think as a person who's grown up here, who's, at first sometimes felt at odds. I'm a documented immigrant as well. And so I just kind of spewed it all out. And like, I think that's important because it just gave me a sense that there was something for me to say. There was something for me to, an opinion to that. And there was a story to tell. So fortunately from there, we moved to actually, getting together. And I think one of the most impactful moments that has like kind of let me continue in this work is the actual reading, is the actual diving into the history that Julie Wise had, created in this book. Because again, immigrant from Honduras, the history is, Mexicans, for the past little bit over a century. But my community, I interpret it very much as like immigrant history, right? Even my stepfather's from Mexico as well. So like, and then there were pieces in the books that mention New Orleans and Hondureños in New Orleans. And I was like, wait, what's that? Let me look into that a little bit. So just that process was a good process for us to reflect, look into it, and then see like, hey, my history or my community's immigrant history doesn't start, when I get here in 2005, right? There's a lot of ancestors, there's a lot of precedents, there's a lot of like change that has happened throughout this time. So that was one of the great projects where we started. I think reflecting on the history of Corazón de Dixie was important, but then talking about it with peers was even more so, because I think we were able to contextualize each other experiences, whether it's from a rural town, from like a more urban center like Durham, and kind of connect where some of those similarities like overlapped, but then where it was different, right? I wasn't growing next to farm workers, but Daisy was, and like how that changed that dynamic for her upbringing was important. So I think we were teasing out all these like nuances of like geography, context, race, economic circumstances by just talking to each other. More recently, we've done a few more video projects as a group that we're hoping I'll showcase a little bit of a trailer for. Still drawing from Julie's work in history, but I was able to do a pretty fun series for myself. I think others would find interesting as well, with just a group of 6 scholars / community leaders, and that range from different areas of the South, where we wanted to really draw upon not just the North Carolina history, but also the history from scholars that are doing work elsewhere. So we had conversations about some of those braceros in terms of Arkansas, but also the more contemporary like history of Latinos in Arkansas, chicken plants in Mississippi, and how those labor struggles, are relevant when you contextualize them into like the racial history there. A little bit about like cultural and music in Appalachia, where you have Latin grass, and they call it Mexi-Latin as well in terms of music. And then more stories closer to home, right? How does a majority Mexican Catholic church, start up in Durham, and how is that tied to the history of like historically Black Catholic churches? So like those are great things that I think I was able to just sit down and talk to scholars, almost like I was like listening to you. I was like, maybe we should make an episode with some of these. But it was really profound because we just got to take the time to do it with them and kind of listen to it. And for me, someone who grew with parents who are storytellers themselves, like, when I was 6, I was selling tortillas or something. I appreciated like sitting and listening. But the real work of us is, how can we get this to other folks that I grew up with in high school, right? That were either born here or came at a young age as well. And, it's really been through that social media like framework. And it's been a challenge because not all of us kind of have this experience of like, hey, let's put this on social media. There's a translation that has to happen from a book to like a phone. And something that I'd love to chat with Dr. Carmona is like, I think Julie and Erik put it well. One of the challenges for us is like, how do we circumvent, this level of barriers that exist within the public education systems to like put this history on there and just get it directly to the people that we want to hear some of these stories. And so I'll leave it at that. I know we'll have a lot more to discuss, and I think I'm gonna try to share screen because that may be easiest, and just share a little like 1-minute clip of a short trailer. Window. And let me know if it looks like we're cool.
I don't think the sound is connected, but we can see it.
Let me check on the sound.
It looks like the sound is muted.
Doesn't give me a setting for it. The sound is one of the best parts. Maybe I will take off my headphones and maybe you can hear a little bit of that overlaid sound. So 1 second.
So, today I want to talk about opportunities. What happens when schools and educators are not equipped to support the children of immigrant families?
It is so important that these spaces are created not only for us, but by us, because we know that these are the experiences that we're having.
The language barrier has been a site of experiencing unjust treatment, but it's also been a site of seeing strength and power in that unlikely place.
It's true. It's true, right? It's true, and that happens. We're going to explore this through the perspectives and experiences of students, parents, and the role of educators. Today we have the opportunity to truly be ourselves.
This is for us, y'all.
That was beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing that. And in this moment where we're seeing this attempt at reasserting the neo-Confederate narrative in public schools, I'm so electrified by that. So thank you so much for that really powerful work. So one of the things that you all have laid out in these sort of opening remarks is some of the most exciting possibilities for public history of Latinx communities in the South. And I'm wondering if there are others that you want to mention to just kind of flesh out people's imaginatory possibilities. What have you seen done that you're really excited about that we haven't talked about yet? Maybe in the last 5 or 7 years. They're things that are really powerful as people are doing this kind of public history work.
Well, I think one of the things that, a lot of the recurring things are going towards is education. So how do we go from these being exhibitions or public history projects, podcasts, to making their way in the classrooms? And I think that that's exactly where, Christopher Carmona just spoke to some of that, which is like, how do we change curriculums? And I think this is when we need those partnerships with educators that actually write new curriculums and put them online and really figure out, like, how does this fit? At least for the Bracero History Project, one of the really amazing things was seeing what the sort of education standards and, requirements are in places like Texas, California, in, states in the Midwest, and even in the South, and trying to figure out how do we develop curriculums or parts of curriculums that can easily be plugged, because some educators, some teachers may have a willingness to do it, but want to know, like, this is the curriculum, it meets this requirement, download it, and here's the stuff that you need, because it's tough to be an educator. So I think that that's one way, and it sounds kind of old school and low tech, but it also works.
So I guess I can kind of follow up on what Mireya was talking about there. So, I mean, just to kind of give you an overview of how we did it here in Texas so far, was really a concerted effort by a lot of different teachers, scholars, and we had really a couple of state board members that really pushed it. Because Texas, every state has a very different way of how they handle their state boards of education. Here in Texas, they're elected officials that are done by districts. And so, obviously the two major people that really helped to push this were the one that represented South Texas and the one that represented the San Antonio area, right? Which makes sense, right? Both Mexican Americans. And so, but when really what the reason that we were able to do it in Texas is because Texas has a very strongly conservative vibe, and the reason that worked in our favor is they're always talking about local control. And so one of the things they did in 2010 is they passed this thing which gave a lot of the power back to the districts to determine how they teach their courses, right? And so what we did, because there's actually in Texas, it's actually a 53% Latino student population. I want to repeat that, 53% student Latino population, right? So we have the majority of students in this state, and the curriculums, didn't reflect that. So that means that Texas itself has a lot of districts that are very open to teaching these type of courses. And so we exploited the special topics area, and because of the way Texas is set up, it allows these districts to do that. And that was our way in. And so now they're trying to shut us down at the state level, which goes completely against their local control, narrative, right? Because it's only local control when it's their agenda. But when it starts, so we exploited that for the past 10 years, and we were able to get these classes made. And because actually at the local levels in a lot of places here in Texas, you have people who are very supportive of this because they have a lot of the Latino student populations, right? And so that is how we've been doing it. At the grassroots level, there's teachers we've been coordinating with, administrators. The Mexican American School Board Association has been very helpful. And so it really takes a lot of work from a lot of people around the state. And this is a big state, right? And we're able to, and if it wasn't for social media and these things, I don't think we would have been able to accomplish what we have here. But, we do know that because of the successes that we've made is the reason why the legislature is doing what it's doing. It's kind of crazy, but But we have gotten a lot of success because at the local level, a lot of these parents and the getting the families involved in all these things helps, because the school boards and the school districts, they really listen to their families, and we get a lot of support from the local. But when we get to the political arena, that's a very different story. But we just keep on pushing because Texas is a crazy state, but but the way we have done it and the way that we continue to do it is we have local organizations, grassroots organizations that help us. These are community organizations like Somos Mas in San Antonio and others who have been doing this work with the local communities that help us push these things. So it's a mixture of a lot of things that we've been able to coordinate to make this really an effort to make this move. So I don't know if that kind of gives you an idea of the work we've been doing here. But Mireya is right. It really getting this curriculum. We had teachers write the what we call the TEACs, which are the standard essential skills and knowledges, which is basically like student learning outcomes at a university, right? And the curriculum, we presented the state board with the curriculum. We did all the work for them so that they didn't have to do it. And that's what we got through, because they're not, these are politicians, they're not going to do this, right? But as long as we did all this free labor for them. Well, we actually not for them, but for the students in this here. We did all that, and we provided all that for free, right? Because that's their biggest talking point: how much is it going to cost us? Well, we provided all this work, and we should be getting paid, but that's not why we're doing it, right? And so there is a lot of that, and learning how to talk to. In a Republican-held state, there's a lot of moderate Republicans that actually, it's a very interesting dynamic. And so right now, it's completely swung the crazy conservative route right now this year, for sure. Yeah, I'll go ahead and stop there.
Erik, you were talking earlier before the session started about how you can kind of see these spikes in the podcast listeners when you think teachers might be assigning an episode for a class. I'm wondering if you all have seen other ways that teachers, either at the K-12 or at the college level, are using the podcast.
So the irony to that is that when approaching this project, we really tried to circumvent the traditional school systems, right? We wanted to take this information straight to the community and create a discussion with the community around something that was evidence-based, because it wasn't really we weren't really advocating to try to get it into the schools. We were really saying, where are they? What is the media that they're using, and how can we tell these stories in a way that are meaningful to them? The irony of that was that what we've learned was that this has become very much a tool for a lot of educators who didn't have these tools at their disposal anyways. So as people are discovering this, we're seeing these spikes in our podcast listenership that we tend to think go along with the academic year, because we tend to get these spikes. So like, oh wow, it's like last month we got 50 new listeners, and they listen to all of them. It's like, somebody must have put that in their syllabus. And so that wasn't as much the intention of it. But we've noticed that educators are hungry for these types of tools and new ways to engage their students around this type of material.
Julio, I'm wondering too if you had sort of a sense of whether student groups came through the museum in large numbers, and just thinking about the politics that Chris was just describing in Texas, and not sure what the politics of public schooling in Miami might be, but that also seems like a very powerful thing, at least for students in, within the geographic area, to be able to see and experience.
Yeah, I mean, Florida is an interesting stay, to say the least, right? But it's navigating some of the materials that's featured in any exhibition can always be really challenging. I mean, and telling the story through material objects is always difficult. For a number of reasons, but at the intersections of race, ethnicity, and gender and sexuality, oftentimes it's pretty easy to kind of point to something and read it as pornography, for example. Like, what is the role of building Latinx communities in Miami in the bathhouse or at spaces that are not read as respectable? And there no doubt there was pushback about telling some of those stories and the ways that we told some of those stories. So in ways you find creative ways to tell that same story that stays true to the narrative and stays true to who I am as a scholar and as a researcher. And navigating parts of what are the critiques of critical race theory, for example, other than really just being critical of U.S. history. I mean, like, that is of the violence of the past more broadly. To go back to the earlier question, though, I just want to kind of put a little bit of the context there outside of like Miami or outside of Florida or outside of a kind of region in particular, more maybe to the South. But just the kind of power, as we've already heard here, of documenting the undocumented, like through a number of crowdsourcing forums and digital archives. I'm thinking of the great work of Diana Sierra Becerra and Jennifer Guglielmo, who are doing this really great digital database on domestic workers, for example, but also at the federal level. And I'm always very skeptical and cynical of some of this work more broadly, as I think we all are. But what is it going to mean for the opening of the National Museum of the American Latino at the Smithsonian? Who's included in that? Who's excluded? Where does Latinx history begin? And then, to kind of throw us somewhere else, but particularly the focus on the U.S. South, which has historically had a kind of fear of federalism and through a number of different ways. But National Park Service designations, for example, have been very slow in the South. But increasingly, we're seeing a lot of Latinx historic sites appear in the national landmark status. And what does that mean? So, and how are those stories going to be told? The first two that come to mind are the Pan American Union headquarters in DC, and the Rio Vista Bracero reception in Socorro, Texas, which heavily cites Mireya, I should know, no surprise. But that is that Latinx history is one of the ways that we're seeing the U.S. South move further into designations through the National Park Service as well.
So I'm curious, before leaving this question altogether, if people have questions for one another around education, just because in the last 4 months, we've seen such it's not a dog whistle, right? It's a full-on holler. It's like a rebel yell to organize people to get out politically, white parents to get out politically to sort of preserve this Confederate history without addressing any of the truth of the nation's past or present. So you all have produced such incredible and thought-provoking stories that we need to hear as a nation. So I'll just open it up to the floor if you want to, if there is nothing to say on this because it's shooting us too far off of the public history front, then we can move on. But it seems like a really powerful moment to pause and see if there are questions you want to propose to one another or that you've been thinking about along these lines as what is in K-12 schools has moved to center stage.
I guess since it's on topic, I had a question that kind of like, I was considering more of the context and the generations. And I wanted to pose for those kind of working with, I guess, specifically more Texas, I guess the relevance of this history as a part of the curriculum or as part of like just like the public knowledge of that like history and ancestry, because the population that we're working with is like, hey, your family came within the last 20 years, let's say in North Carolina, or even myself, like I'm interested in this. But like the significance or meaning for those who have, generations upon generations is different. So I guess like I wanted to just get that question in terms of the students at Texas. Like, how do they interact with that history when it's like been denied for them? Not, you know, during the last few decades, but like for almost centuries.
I think I'll take that question, Axel, since I deal a lot with Texas. So I teach a Chicano Latinx schooling class, which is kind of a history of schooling of Latino Chicano students, and also coming from a family that has basically been here in the same area really for 300, 400 years, right? You know, my family goes, we were, you know, I was looking into like my family history and how, like, well, your great grandparents were Mexican. Yeah, because Texas was Mexico, right? And then it changed on us, right? So we haven't changed. It's actually the U.S. It became the U.S. And so we have a lot of that here, right? Where we have this shift because of what happened with the, you know, the Mexico and U.S. war, right? So where the whole entire Southwest, and even parts of like Arkansas and Louisiana and others, right, became the U.S. instantly almost in 1948, but yet we're still treated as second-class citizens. But I think one thing that I deal a lot with, especially when dealing with the history, is the immigrant narrative gets overlaid, I think, on all Latinos, right? And it kind of ignores this history, the fact that there's a lot of, you know, Latinos that have been here for a long time that have a very different history of this, right? Especially in Texas and a lot of the Southwest region up into California, there is a population. But also we have to be careful with that, because then we don't want to turn it into an us versus like immigrant status, because that's also a very, you know, toxic conversation, right? It's not about who's been here longer or whatever, but the narrative is being controlled by this idea that anybody who's not white is an immigrant somehow, right? And they even do that with African slavery, right? They call them, well, I think they compared them to like Irish indentured servants in one of the textbooks that we had to get banned. Stuff like that, right? That they're trying to reassert this white supremacist narrative constantly. And that is happening now, right? Because I think there is a lot of change that us and a lot of other people have been trying to make in the public school system that is decentering that narrative. And I think for Latinos, and especially in Texas and place, I didn't learn a lot of this history until I was in graduate school. I mean, you know, that is I think the reality for most of us scholars of color, right? I didn't get this information till way late. And that's one of the reasons why I started doing this work. Is like, imagine what I would have been able to do differently if I would have gotten this when I was, you know, in 8th grade, or, you know, and as in high school. How much more could I have done at this point, right? And so none of like our students aren't getting that as much. But, you know, at the same time, I think, well, I grew up a lot with the stories that my grandparents told me about. And that always conflicted with what was in the school, the textbooks, and what was taught in school. And there's also, you know, what I grew up with is my grandparents would always tell me is you never talk to white people about these stories. And there's a protection because they're afraid of retaliation, because they lived through this time of the Matanza. They lived through this kind of, you know, this all the way up until the 1960s. We did not have any Chicanos in power, right, or any Latinos in any sort of like law enforcement. And so you still had this thing. And so my grandparents grew up with that mentality. It's like, you can tell you what really happened, but you can't tell white people. I remember that constantly. And now I think we're in a position where we can start just voice again, right? So this is something, but that generation never got to. They're always afraid of retaliation because it was a very real thing. And these stories of, you know, of Texas Ranger violence don't end after this period. There's reports of it going all the way into the 1960s, right? It's not something it's something that's embedded in this. You know, police brutality is, I think, a problem with all communities of color, specifically African American, Latino communities in particular. But it is something that that is a difficult thing to get into the classroom. But I think it's important to do that. And yeah, I think it's you know, there's a lot with that. How do we deal with the history? How do we deal how we've been taught this history? But what I've known from the students who learn this history is they fear a validation of who they are, and that not just from students of color, but also from white students as well. Because you know, then they start to realize that they're not actually white, that they're actually like Irish immigrants and German and all these other things, and they start to relate to that cultural history more so than this white narrative, right? And so it does this kind of critical work, and I think the students themselves kind of see that.
Thank you so much, Chris. Does anybody else want to respond to Axel's provocation? I mean, I think one of the pieces that really resonates for me is that that you all are approaching these incredibly powerful public histories and these material culture objects with a level of trust and relational. Your focus on maintaining that trust that Chris just talked about as being so vital is really hard to do in public when the public includes people sort of out, including the white gaze, right? And so I feel like you're each making incredibly important interventions that are available to everyone while maintaining that trust and relationship with the people whose stories are sacred, right? And that you're sharing. So I don't know if you can talk a little bit about that, but I'm really excited and energized by hearing about how each of you are approaching that really difficult balance.
I through this Nuestro South project has opened my eyes to a lot of history that I didn't know existed before. My grandfather was a bracero, and this was the first in the stories that I knew about that really came from my grandmother. And the stories that my grandmother kind of passed down to me were actually when he was stories. They were really sort of like a call to action on her part, because my grandfather had died as a young man, and she had expected this money that was supposed to have come to her all of her life. On her deathbed, she mentioned it. And it left me with this real cynicism about both the US and the Mexican agreement that came. And I didn't know anything more than what my grandmother had told me until I started going into this Nuestro South project, where we went into an exploration of braceros in Arkansas post World War II. And so, you know, I've visited the bracero archives, and it gave me a different view, seeing the pictures, seeing how, you know, it really kind of changed my perspective some to what the stories that my grandmother had told me. And I'm interested in knowing, and not only that, but I've also now recognized how that particular movement, I don't know how we would refer to it, but that whole bracero era still is what we are doing today. And I'm wondering from Dr. Loza, if you are seeing at all in these moments around immigration and where we are with the borders, any callback to how that moment of time is impacting what is happening now?
Definitely. So, you know, for full disclosure, when Julie went to Arkansas, I was there. So I was carrying out the oral histories in Spanish. And one of the reasons why she had the backing of the Bracero History Project is because I actually went to the National Museum of American History's kind of leadership. And I was like, you're insane. We should go to the South. And they're like, well, we'd be spending a lot of resources, and there isn't that many braceros there. And I'm like, it's not a number game here. It's basically looking at these gaps in this rich history that we're missing. what happens when these men go into basically landscapes that are racialized is very black and white. So what happens? And I think one of the really sort of eye-opening things there was, that legacy of the perception of race. You could see in people's faces when I arrived with Julie, the reaction that they had to me, because for some reason, but because of the way I look. So not for some reason, because of the way I look, that they connected this kind of descendants of braceros, right? And they said things that at times were really off-putting. And I realized that part of my job as a oral historian is I'm not there to be the judge and jury. I tell people that I'm capturing the story, and if that's what they want to put on the record, then I will gladly capture that. And for some people, the kind of moments of alienation that they didn't see, hindsight, there was no moment of seeing this as like atrocious, like that they gave men numbers. And, one man explained, but that's what they were. They were a number, because everybody's kind of named Jose and Juan. And for them not to have that kind of like, holy crap, this is not, even in the present, it's not okay, right? So I think that in places of the South, you're still dealing with a lot of that kind of, the kind of perceptions of race that really were solidified in the Bracero program. That one, these communities of color were deportable. That one, their value is labor. That is their sole value. They're not here to be bakers, painters, singers. They're here to be labor. And you could see that unfold. And, during my last trip to the South before the pandemic to Dunn, North Carolina, I work with communities, I explain what I do, and oftentimes there's moments of coming full circle. In Dunn, North Carolina, the Episcopal Farm Workers Ministry explained, well, you're coming in right before the H-2A workers come in, those braceros. And I said, of course you have H-2A workers here. That makes total sense to me. Of course you do, right? And so these long legacies of how those expectations of who Latino populations were and how they were supposed to serve agriculture and how they shape the present, basically social relationships, and the expectation that this is okay. This is perfectly okay to have people who can vanish because we don't need them here full round, and then to resent the people who stay there year round, right? A deep resentment of the people who build community, of the people who build lives despite this mechanism that's supposed to have them here and push them out. And to me, those relationships, the past always has that deep relationship with the present, and in these places in the South, it didn't also matter that somebody was not Mexican, they were Central American, because the kind of ideas they had about Latinidad and race were so cemented in particular moments. And for me, the Bracero program is one of those, right? For other people, it's other moments, and they're all valid. But I think that these things do have a reach. They do. And so for young Central American kids to kind of feel the power of racialization, despite not being Bracero, Mexican guest worker, it's partly because people learned lessons about race through these other populations.
Mireya, I'm wondering if in the many, many different ways that you've seen people interact with the archive that you've built, if there are particularly powerful ways that you think educators at any level or museums help us imagine some of the ways that you've seen people take these histories, these oral histories, and the material objects and connect the most effectively.
So I think there's a lot of ways. Some teachers have taken the transcripts and the audios into the classrooms and have asked the students basically a series of questions. Sometimes they come directly from the curriculum built for the Bracero History Project. Sometimes they adapt the curriculum to their needs. I mean, quite frankly, the Bracero History Project really became popular in many ways because I think, and this is odd to say this in public, but I think people saw the end of the Bracero program as 1964 and that it didn't have these long fingers into the present, right? And the fact that we didn't discuss H-2A workers and the fact that people saw it as a chapter that had ended in American history made it so that in the political present, teachers could say, well, let's talk about it. The truth of the matter is that Mexican guest workers have been coming for over 100 years, right? And I sometimes think that in public history, I learned a lot of lessons about what I did that I'm proud of. And I learned a lot of lessons about what my book can do or what these other projects can do that an exhibition or a archive can't do. And, you know, I think in a lot of ways, I do learn a lot from people around me. I mean, I learned a lot about how to think about respectability and sexuality through the work of, you know, Dr. Capó, or think about violence through, you know, Professor Carmona and Monica Martinez's work, right? So how do you really basically show and exhibit the things that communities sometimes don't want to show and exhibit? That's what I'm most excited about. Like, so how do we get these curriculums on topics that are really, you know, meaty, complicated topics into the curriculum? So like if, you know, Dr. Capó, Professor Carmona want to talk about that, I'm all ears, because I sometimes see that the limits of what could have been done in an exhibition about braceros or an archive on braceros is not what the community wanted in terms of what a full-on display of who they were. And a lot of times in public history, the museum world is kind of a commemorative world, right? To commemorate and to basically imagine ourselves in particular ways. So how do you basically present a really complicated, richer image of people that want a kind of simple celebratory image?
Yeah, that's a difficult. What I do with my students, because I teach down, you know, in the Rio Grande Valley, is I have them basically conduct oral histories with their grandparents. And when they do that, and some of their, you know, grandparents are in Mexico, and they do it through Zoom or whatever. But they start to tell, because I ask them I ask them not to ask like sociological questions, but just ask them about their lives. Because if you ask them a sociology, they're not going to understand what that means. It's like, how has racism affected you when you were a kid? They're not going to understand what that context of is. So I ask them, like, you know, what was it like when you were growing up? And and what I get, and I start to collect these stories that they do, is a lot of these stories that are not told, but they're able to tell them to their own grandchildren, right? In this setting, and these stories come out, right? And what we've been able to start to do is to kind of collect these in this kind of oral history, I guess, archive that we have, right? To kind of keep these stories, because I think that, you know, actually when we did the exhibit at the Bullock Museum here in Texas years ago with Refusing to Forget, a lot of those items that we used for that were personal family items from people. Like this was my great grandmother's wedding dress and all these different things. When you see things like that, and, you know, seeing that kind of those exhibits and bringing in those objects that are family primal objects, they come with stories, right? And these are very different stories than they're used to hearing about the farm worker who just works and goes and that's it, right? No, these people had lives too, right? They contributed in a different capacity. So I think that those are the kind of things that we kind of try to do, is like, what kind of objects does your family have? Tell us a story. You know, that brings out a whole bunch for when I deal with my students. Or also just, you know, interview your grandparents. And, you know, there was one of them when one of my students was interviewing her grandmother, and she was asking, just this is the first time taking a Mexican American history studies course, right? And she was saying, like, well, you know, Cesar Chavez used to stay in the back room here when he came through. It was like, and the student was like, what? You knew Cesar Chavez? Like, yeah, he would always be here. It was like they didn't realize that they're that connected to history, right? because to like these people, it's like there's just this guy with the UFW would come here. He didn't have a place to stay. We would just hold, but now he's in history books, and I think that kind of connection between the generations is something that both helps the older generation validate their stories and the younger generation realize that this history matters. So I don't know if that helps you, Mireya, but yeah.
Just to piggyback a little bit off, for me, the big questions here are about how how all this work is decolonizing knowledge production and decolonizing archives and what constitutes archive. Like, the podcast and the exhibitions, for instance, are providing us a really important and necessary way for knowledge to enter the publics. The oral histories are challenging the violence of the archives and telling us that to listen and to preserve storytellers' stories and their histories, especially those that have been systematically erased. And at the end of the exhibition of Queer Miami, we had we asked people who felt comfortable to leave testimonials of their Queer Miami, what their Queer Miami looked like, so that the History Miami Museum, which never had really made an effort to collect LGBTQR, because it wasn't an LGBT for a number of reasons, right? Actually, and what one of the things that really surprised me, every week or so I would try to go to the museum, more or less, and read like the latest things that were there. And one of the things that always shocked me is how, especially the testimonials of undocumented people, how the exhibition spoke to them, and how the undocumented were leaving evidence of their being, right? Like in this space of their LGBTQ experience in Miami. And that is that there was a space there for them to stay, to make sure their voices were heard and preserved and for the record, in ways that I thought were really powerful.
Can I ask a question before we open it up? So in terms of the podcast, I'm always curious about like topics that people don't necessarily want to have public discussions about, right? And I want to ask Mr. Ramos and Valera, like, have you ever created a podcast where people are like, we're just not ready for that topic?
What the advantage that we have is that we kind of created this kind of like insular dynamic. When the first time when we had done the podcast, we had agreed that just the podcast hosts and the producer would be in the room. I wasn't in the room. Julie wasn't in the room. It was just them. And so it was just a conversation amongst friends around these stories. So it wasn't like the topics were off. I don't think that there were any topics that were off limit. Where we kind of encountered that a little bit more was when we started opening it up to Instagram lives. And we started looking for other folks to be able to tell us their story. And they're like, the folks the only folks who raised their hands, as I can tell, and actually you can elaborate on this, were those who are already doing activist work in the communities. And so, which sort of veers it a little bit further away from what we with these personal stories, because there's a bit of a different agenda in those. But at the same time, we have to honor their bravery in being those first adopters to being able to tell this story in an environment that could potentially be hostile. But I think that was kind of the recipe to getting our hosts. We had these hosts that were already willing to do it, and we gave them the space to go, you do. And it was, I don't know that was like, what we learned from that also was that they need a little bit more direction. I think in terms of, how to produce, not just tell a story, because you could just go on and on and on. So we've learned a lot, and that's how our model has created a little bit more of a balance between that kind of free flow, long form train of thought to being a little bit more specific, and that's where we're heading towards now. But you can talk a little bit more about that, Axel.
Yeah, I think the first thing that comes to mind, you asked the question, and I kind of just like asked it to myself. Did I have anything off limits? And no, because I think I felt an ownership over the project, and like let me like, and then there was also the trust amongst the folks that we were like discussing things with. So like the This Is For Us, Y'all is kind of like it was probably came out of one of our brainstorming things. Even Nuestro came out of like just like conversation we were having, but it was like it's like signals something to others, but it's also like very internal, right? We're creating this for someone like us that, you know, maybe at a high school right now that, you know, does not hear this around us. Just a conversation and session I was at yesterday where we were doing some of this kind of like inward looking / exploration of like through my job of like, what does home in North Carolina look for us now? And just taking that ownership of like the geography, the space, is something that a lot of folks don't get while they're growing up. Some of the folks, you know, even mentioned, you know, I was ready to leave this state because I was so done with it. But, you know, the process of engaging with peers who kind of like collectively come to this consensus, like, yeah, I kind of claim this spot now, is something that allows us to have that comfort of saying like, let's engage in these conversations that maybe somebody else will. I've actually haven't even thought much about like, you know, trolls or backlash on Instagram. We're just kind of like having that freedom to just put that out there, and to touch to maybe some of those tougher, more taboo conversations, and to the question that was added by Professor Marquez on the chat, for example, of like anti-Blackness. I think for my generation, we grew up, especially like those who go through college and high school, and grow up with like various communities that are Black, white, and kind of in between. We actually have to have some of these conversations of race or anti-Blackness at home all the time. So in terms of putting it out there on a social platform, I think it feels natural because we've had to do it as well. And one of our scholars who was part of the interviews actually shared a couple of days ago how they had a 2-hour conversation with a cousin from Texas that listened to the podcast about anti-Blackness, right? Because they were able to listen to two folks who had experienced it, lived through it, right? Whether that's Atlanta suburbs or, you know, Durham, North Carolina. And we're talking about it in a very like nuanced but personal way. And I think that opened the space for those harder conversations than like if you're just reading a claim or a thesis from someone about like what this means for, you know, racial dynamics in like across the South. So I think it's a bit of trust, and it's a bit of just like kind of boldness, really. Like, this is for us, y'all, period.
Actually, you may not remember one of the first times we met when we first when we first came to my place in my house, when we first met all as a group, and I brought to your attention, I'm like, you know, when we put this out there, we have to be ready. There's going to be some people who don't want to hear it, and there could be some backlash. And I don't know if you remember what your response was to that.
Probably not.
It was bring it. And so I'm like, all right, we have the right team.
I feel like that's the right note to end it on. Bring it. I mean, I'm so incredibly grateful for the processes that are so thoughtful and rich and creative that you've come up with individually and together for putting these vital histories in the public schools and museums and podcasts and all these places, sometimes very much needing to be broken open, like Chris is talking about, and in other ways, just putting it out there, like Erik and Axel have talked about, so that people can get it wherever they are. But it's been so important, this work, and I'm so grateful for everyone sharing today, and so excited to see what comes next for each of you. So thank you so much for being together with us today. Thank you to the people who came in with us today in the session, and wishing everybody a great rest of the week.
Thank you.
Adios.
Thanks, y'all.